Carol folds the same piece of paper 3 times before she puts it back in the drawer. It's a bill from the pharmacy. She's not going to fill that prescription this month. She's going to stretch the old one a few more days instead, the way she has before. She's 68 years old. She spent 31 years as a home health aide outside Toledo, Ohio, lifting people who couldn't lift themselves on her feet 10 hours a day, in a job that never quite paid what the work was worth. Her Social Security check is $980 a month. Her rent alone is $820. Everything else, the electric bill, the pharmacy, food, has to fit into what's left, which isn't much. Carol didn't end up here because of a mistake she made. She ended up here because the formula that decided her benefit was built around the wages she actually earned, and she never earned much. Right now, sitting in a committee room in Washington, there's a bill that was written, at least on paper, with people exactly like Carol in mind. It might never become law, but if you've ever done that same kind of math, stretching a check, stretching a prescription, wondering what happens if the numbers stop working, you need to know exactly what's in this bill, what it actually changes, and why almost none of it is guaranteed yet. Stay with me, because the answer isn't as simple as it passes or it doesn't. The proposal is called the Social Security 2100 Act, officially H.R. 9519, introduced in the House by Representative John Larson of Connecticut in late June of 2026. Before we go any further, here's the single most important sentence in this entire documentary. This is a bill, not a law. As of this recording, it's sitting in committee. It has 0 co-sponsors. Independent legislative trackers that estimate a bill's odds of passing currently give this one essentially no chance of becoming law in its current form. That doesn't make it meaningless, though. Versions of this same bill have been introduced in Congress repeatedly since 2017, and pieces of that ongoing conversation have a way of resurfacing in later negotiations, even when the original bill dies in committee. So we're not going to treat this as a promise. We're going to treat it as what it is, a detailed proposal, and walk through exactly what it says it would do compared to what the law actually says today. Here's where it gets interesting, because the changes go a lot further than most people expect. Start with the number every retiree actually feels every month, the size of the check itself. Social Security calculates your benefit using something called a replacement rate. Think of it as a formula that looks at your highest earning working years and replaces a percentage of that income once you retire. Right now, for the lowest portion of a person's lifetime earnings, that formula replaces 90%. The bill would raise that to 93%. That's not a flat raise where everyone gets an extra $50 a month. It's a percentage built into the math itself. So the real dollar impact depends on your own earnings history. But here's why it matters. Because the increase targets the lowest slice of a person's earnings record, workers who spent their careers in lower-paying jobs would feel it more than someone who spent decades earning 6 figures. It's a raise engineered to lean toward the people who need it most. But that's only part of the story, because the size of your check is only half the equation. The other half is whether that check keeps pace with what things actually cost. That's where the annual cost of living adjustment comes in, the COLA, the yearly bump meant to keep your benefit in step with inflation. And if you've ever felt like your COLA never quite covers what your bills actually went up by, there's a real reason for that. COLA is currently calculated using an index built around the spending habits of working-age Americans, called the CPIW. The problem is that retirees don't spend money the way a 35-year-old commuting to an office does. Retirees spend disproportionately more on healthcare and housing, 2 categories that tend to inflate faster than almost everything else in the average shopping cart. There's a separate index, the CPIE, built specifically to track the spending patterns of Americans 62 and older. The bill would require Social Security to use whichever of the 2 indexes is higher in a given year, whether that's the CPIW or the CPIE, but only from 2027 through 2036. That expiration date matters, and it's worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how this entire bill is constructed. A lot of its most generous provisions aren't permanent fixes. They're 10-year experiments, scheduled to expire right around the time people would come to depend on them. Keep that pattern in mind, because you're going to see it again. Here's the part of the bill that would matter most to someone like Carol. And it's where the proposal starts to feel less like an adjustment and more like a genuine safety net. Today, if you spent decades in a low-paying job, your Social Security benefit is calculated the exact same way as everyone else's, as a percentage of what you actually earned. If what you earned was never much, your benefit reflects that, permanently for the rest of your life. The bill would create a brand new minimum benefit for workers with more than 10 years in the workforce whose lifetime earnings were low. It works on a sliding scale. Put in 11 years and you'd have a guaranteed floor set at a small fraction of the federal poverty level. Keep working, and that floor rises with you, reaching the full poverty level at around 26 years, and topping out at 125% of the poverty level once someone has 30 years or more in the workforce. Let's turn that into a real number because this is where a lot of coverage of this bill gets vague. The 2026 federal poverty guideline for a single person is $15,650 a year, about $1,304 a month. At the top tier of this provision, a floor set at 125% of that guideline would come out to roughly $19,500 a year, or somewhere around $1,600 a month. Here's why that distinction actually matters. This provision doesn't raise everyone's benefit. It only lifts the people whose calculated benefit falls below that new floor. If your benefit is already above it, this provision changes nothing for you. It's not a general increase, it's a rescue line aimed specifically at people whose working lives never generated much income to begin with, no matter how many decades they put in. There's a moment in a marriage that almost nobody plans for financially, and it's the moment one spouse dies. Under current law, the surviving spouse typically keeps the larger of the two Social Security benefits and loses the smaller one entirely. For a couple whose household budget depended on both checks arriving every month, that can mean losing a third or more of their income overnight. At the exact moment, grief already makes everything harder to manage. This is often called the widow's penalty, and it's one of the most financially destabilizing moments in American retirement. The bill addresses it head-on. It would guarantee a surviving spouse either the deceased spouse's full benefit amount or 75% of what the couple was receiving together, whichever is larger, with a cap built in so the payout doesn't exceed certain limits. In plain terms, it's designed to close the gap between what a couple needed to get by together and what one person is left to survive on alone. Why this matters over the long run? For a couple who relied on 2 checks for 20 years of retirement, closing even part of that gap can mean the difference between staying in their home and having to leave it. There's a related change for people who've simply been collecting Social Security for a long time. If you've been receiving benefits for 15 years or more, the bill would phase in an additional increase, starting small in year 16 and building to a full increase by year 20. And just like the COLA change, this one is also written to expire, running only from 2027 through 2036. But benefits for retirees and widows are only one piece of this bill. What happens next surprises a lot of people, because some of the biggest changes here don't touch the size of anyone's check at all. They change who gets counted by the system in the first place. I'm John, and if any of this is making you think about your own numbers right now, that's exactly why I make these videos. Every week, I break down what's actually changing, and what isn't, in Social Security, Medicare, and retirement policy, in plain language, without the political noise. If that's useful to you, stay with me, because there's a lot more in this bill, including the part almost nobody talks about, how it proposes to actually pay for all of this. Take caregiving. If you left the workforce for years to care for a young child, an aging parent, or a disabled family member, current law treats those years as a gap, a stretch of zero income that quietly drags down your eventual benefit, because Social Security calculates your check using your highest earning years, and a zero pulls that average straight down. The bill would let people who provided at least 960 hours of unpaid care in a year, roughly 20 hours a week, count up to 5 of those years as if they'd earned half of the national average wage, even if their actual income during that time was nothing at all. It wouldn't happen automatically. It would require an application and documentation. But structurally, it's an attempt to stop punishing the unpaid work that quietly keeps millions of American families functioning. Then there's disability. And this is where the current system creates a problem that catches a lot of people off guard. Even after someone is approved for Social Security disability insurance, a process that can already take months or years of appeals, there's a mandatory 5-month waiting period before the very first check arrives. For someone who's already unable to work, that gap is often the difference between staying housed and losing everything. The bill would eliminate that waiting period entirely, so benefits could begin the very first month someone becomes eligible. Here's where things get more complicated, though. The bill also tries to fix what happens when a disability recipient tries to go back to work. Today, earning too much can trigger benefits stopping abruptly, an all-or-nothing cliff that makes a lot of people afraid to even attempt part-time work, for fear of losing their entire safety net at once. The bill would replace that cliff with a gradual phase-out instead. For every $2 earned above a certain threshold, the benefit would only drop by $1. And like several provisions before it, this one is also written to apply only from 2027 through 2036. Two more groups are worth understanding here. Children of retired, disabled, or deceased workers currently lose their benefit at 18 or 19 if they're still in high school. The bill would extend that eligibility all the way to age 26 for unmarried students enrolled at least half-time in college or trade school, and relatives raising someone else's child, not just grandparents, but aunts, uncles, cousins, and more distant relatives, including situations where a court has formally placed a child in their custody, would have an easier path to accessing that child's benefits as long as the child genuinely lives with and depends on them. And then there's a fix for a problem that quietly punishes low-income households every January. When Social Security benefits rise, that increase can sometimes push someone's income just high enough to disqualify them from SSI, Medicaid, or CHIP, which means a benefit increase can actually leave a household worse off overall once you account for what they lose. The bill would exempt these specific increases from counting as income for those three programs. Worth saying plainly, SNAP, the Federal Food Assistance Program, is not included in that protection under the bill's current language, which means the exact problem this section is designed to solve could still happen with grocery benefits, even if this bill becomes law exactly as written. Every expansion we've just walked through costs real money, and Social Security's trust funds are already under strain. So here's the question that decides whether any of this is realistic. How does the bill propose to actually pay for it? Two mechanisms do almost all of the work. First, it would eliminate the wage cap on Social Security payroll taxes. Here's how that tax works today, because it surprises a lot of people once they understand it. In 2026, workers and employers each pay 6.2% of wages into Social Security, but only on earnings up to a hard ceiling of $184,500 a year. Every dollar earned above that ceiling is completely exempt from the tax. In practice, that means someone earning $200,000 a year pays Social Security tax on essentially the same amount as someone earning $800,000 or $8 million. The tax simply stops once the cap is hit, sometimes within the first few days of January for the highest earners in the country. The bill would remove that ceiling, applying the tax to income at every level starting after 2026. Second, it would add a new 12.4% tax on net investment income for individuals earning more than $400,000 a year. That's significant because investment income, things like capital gains and dividends, has never funded Social Security at all. The program has always been financed by taxing wages, which means high earners whose income comes mostly from investments, not paychecks, have largely sat outside the system that funds these benefits. This provision would change that. The bill would also merge Social Security's two separate trust funds, one for retirement and survivors, one for disability, into a single unified fund. On its own, this doesn't create a single new dollar. What it does is simplify how the program's solvency gets tracked and reported, since most financial analysts already assume that if one fund ever ran short, the money would functionally get pooled between them anyway. Here's the honest limitation, though, and it deserves to be said clearly. Whether these two financing mechanisms would fully cover the cost of every benefit expansion in this bill is ultimately a question for the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan office that scores exactly how a bill's revenue and spending balance out over time. That kind of analysis shifts as a bill moves through the legislative process, so any total cost figure you hear attached to this bill should be treated as an estimate, not a settled fact. The last major part of this bill has nothing to do with how much money lands in anyone's pocket. It's about whether the agency behind Social Security can actually function. And if you've tried calling the Social Security Administration recently, you already know exactly why this part exists. The bill would require the agency to maintain staffing levels at least equal to where they stood in January of 2025, and would make it significantly harder to close or consolidate local field offices without extensive public notice and hearings first. It would bar political appointees from accessing individuals' personal Social Security data, create real financial penalties, including a minimum right to sue for $5,000 per violation for improper access or disclosure of that data, and require the agency's Inspector General to report data breaches directly to Congress. There's also a fix for a problem that's affected a growing number of people in recent years, being wrongly marked as deceased in Social Security's records, which can cut off benefits instantly and take months to reverse. The bill would create a similar right to seek damages for anyone put through that. And then there's overpayments, a genuinely brutal issue for a lot of families, and one you may have experienced personally. If Social Security miscalculates and overpays someone through no fault of their own, current policy allows the agency to claw that money back by withholding a large share of future monthly checks, sometimes up to half. The bill would cap that recovery rate at 10% of the monthly benefit, unless the recipient specifically asks for a faster repayment schedule themselves. None of this makes for a dramatic headline. But if you've ever spent 45 minutes on hold trying to fix a mistake that wasn't yours, you understand exactly why it's in here. And why, for a lot of people, this unglamorous part might matter just as much as anything else in the bill. Here's the honest picture, laid out plainly. The Social Security 2100 Act, as written, would raise the minimum benefit for long-term low-wage workers, close a dangerous gap for surviving spouses, eliminate a waiting period that punishes disabled Americans for being disabled, credit unpaid caregivers for work that's always counted in every sense except financially, and fund a meaningful share of it by finally asking the highest earners to pay into the system on their full income the same way every other worker already does. It's also true, at the very same time, that several of its most meaningful provisions are written to expire in 2036, that it currently sits in committee with no co-sponsors, and that independent trackers give it essentially no chance of becoming law in its current form. Neither of those facts cancels the other out. That's simply how most ambitious legislation begins its life in Washington. Bills like this one rarely pass exactly as introduced. What often happens instead is that their most defensible, most popular pieces get pulled piece by piece into other negotiations over months or even years. So, what do you actually do with all of this today, while none of it is law yet? You do the same thing that's always been true: bill or no bill. Check your annual Social Security statement for accuracy, understand your own claiming options, and build your retirement plan around the law as it exists right now, not around a proposal that hasn't passed. Hope is not a financial strategy, but understanding exactly what's being proposed and exactly what isn't guaranteed is something you can actually put to use, regardless of what happens to this particular bill in Washington. Carol doesn't know if this bill will ever reach her kitchen table. Most bills like it don't. But somewhere between the version of Social Security we have today and the one being argued about in that committee room, there's a simple truth worth holding on to. The system was never going to fix itself. It only ever changes when enough people understand it well enough to ask better questions of it. And now you do.